Okay, thank you everyone. I really appreciate being given this time for this really important topic. We are going to be doing some informational giving, some informational gathering. You'll have time to chat with somebody at your table about some of this really important work that we've been doing with safety, respect, and equitable Jewish workplaces. I'd like to introduce Nicole Navarez, who is the National Director of Ta'amod Stand Up. She's going to be leading us through our morning together. Okay, no hand hold. I can
No. The handheld mics.
Okay, while we're working on that, I'll jump in for time. So good morning. Thank you so much for spending your time with me this morning. I know you've been sitting for a while and listening for a while. Thank you. Thank you. I don't stand behind a podium all that well. So we're gonna, as Joy said, we're gonna spend some time together learning, but also we do things interactive in Jewish education, so there'll be some time for that. I really want to thank Joy also for asking me to be here. I've had the pleasure of working with her in the Safety, Respect, Equity Coalition work that we've been doing over the last I've been here a year, but a couple of years of SRE, and it's really been an incredible opportunity to work with several leaders, professional lay leaders around the country in work toward creating safe, respectful, equitable Jewish communal spaces that are also workplaces. I just have a question before we start. How many of you are on another board, period? You're on the board of somewhere else. So almost everybody in the room, not surprising. And how many of you are on the board of your local JCC as well as this year? Okay. So everything that we're going to be doing together today is about learning, it's about awareness raising, and it's about reflection, really. So some of the things we'll talk about are already being implemented in some of the Jewish workplaces that we may interact as board members or professionals, and some of them are to think about, but it's really just about learning together. This work, SRA Coalition's work, right now, and we'll talk about this in a minute, is about raising awareness. We're at a new moment in our culture, and I like to say we can't heal what we can't see. Right? So we're really at a moment of building awareness around what's going on in our workplace culture. So we're just going to go back and forth a little, so you can do a little note checking of who's up for which slide. So I want to start with a question, and I'm going to invite you to get your voices in the room. This work that we've started with SRE Coalition started with the Me Too movement, right? The Jewish community really rushed forward to say all of these realities, all of these voices that are being raised around harassment and how primarily women have been treated in the Jewish workplace, in workplaces in general. It's happening in our community as much as anywhere else because it happens everywhere. It's part of our culture. It's the beginning of the awareness raising where we are starting to understand some of the norms that have been set that are not supporting humans in the workplace. So in the wake of Me Too, as we started to raise this question, I want to ask you, whose voices do you hear in the Jewish community in the last couple of years, besides me and Joy? I promise you there's an answer. If not, then there's your answer. Yes, Barak?
The leadership of the Schusterman Foundation.
Okay, the leadership of the Schusterman Foundation. So Lisa Eisen, you may be familiar or not, is co-chair, right, of the Safety, Respect, Equity Coalition, which Joy will explain a little bit more in a moment. So Lisa Eisen has been absolutely out in front of this conversation, but she's in leadership of a big group of other leaders around the country who I mentioned before. Anyone else? It doesn't have to be a specific person. Yeah.
The rabbinic community.
The rabbinic community has begun to speak up also. Yeah.
JWI.
Jewish Women's International, whose new CEO is Meredith Jacobs, has done a lot of work. And part of that is that that organization has been a recipient of a grant, as many of us have been. That's how Ta'amod exists, and I'll explain Ta'amod a little bit in a minute. Anyone else? What are the responsibilities of the Jewish community in this issue? What's our responsibility?
Safe workplace.
safe workplaces.
I think we owe it to our people we work with to treat them with dignity and respect.
We owe it to the people we work with to treat them with dignity and respect. I'm just going to repeat so everybody can hear.
Yeah, and I think we have a special responsibility, given the way we as a minority have been treated historically. I think we have an extra responsibility to be leaders in the sector.
Knowing what it's like to be a people who have experienced mistreatment, we have some responsibility that's a little specific.
To publicly document as transparently as possible what are bad practices and what are good practices.
So truth, right? To be willing to stand up and say, right, like, this is happening here too, and we're gonna say what the reality is. I saw another hand, yes.
Since most of our organizations are built on women and women's efforts, even though they aren't led by women, we have to be especially cognizant of the women who are there, who have talents that we need to build on, and try to reform our organizations into places that the women have equal opportunities, and we might not ask them to work 7 days a week or all 6 days a week and come in late for hours.
Thank you. I would also argue that looking at the sort of drive of Jewish workplaces that are mostly nonprofit and often under human resourced, right? Part of respectful workplace practice is how hard are we driving people? Not to mention all the statistics on the harder we drive, the less productive we are, impacts our bottom line. Yes, David?
So many of the bad guys out there are Jewish. And it's embarrassing. It's actually shameful every time you see an Epstein or Weinstein name out there. And we have to counteract that, transcend that somehow.
So there's another piece, right, which is that this is coming up around the Jewish world. We could have a whole conversation around why, and we won't go into that. But that's a piece of our responsibility too. I love this. I love that everybody understands why it's the responsibility of the community. And I'm going to add a piece about Jewish values in a minute. I also just want to say, does anybody know the statistics on, anybody who's familiar with the leading edge work, on how many women are in the Jewish workforce, what the percentage is? 70. So 70% of the Jewish workforce are women, people who identify as female. And what percent are in the C-suite? 30%, right? And if you flip it the other way, 70% of the C-suite are men and 30% are women. So something's going on there. When we talk about Me Too, when we talk about the issues around harassment, what we know is that we've also raised the voice around gender equity, and they really can't be separated. And lastly, which stakeholders should respond? And are they doing so? Who are the stakeholders in the Jewish community who should be responding? By the way, just by being part of the Jewish community, you're a stakeholder. Everyone. Thank you. Everyone. Whether you're in lay leadership, professional leadership, it's our collective responsibility as the Jewish people. And I'm so glad to see that Dolly Cooks is going to be at your summit. She's the founding executive director of Leading Edge, who is doing absolutely cutting edge work in assessing Jewish workplace culture. Actually, their 2020 study is just about to come out. Am I handing this to you?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm handing this to you now.
So in 2018, we launched our partnership with the Safety, Respect, and Equity Coalition at the biennial, so it's not yet even 2 years along in our work. And that Safety, Respect, and Equity Coalition is a volunteer organization of dozens of other organizations and growing every day. Many JCCs have already signed on to the statement and the commitment that's been put out there to have safe, respectful, and equitable workplaces. And I was appointed as our person to be the leader of the JCC Association commitment to that. And it's evolving, and we're learning every day. This is all new to everyone. And part of why we're doing this is because we want to bring this awareness to you on our board and to all the JCCs as well. And you'll see as we go through a lot of what we're working on already, you'll see how we're making this happen in the JCCs.
Thank you. So, sort of the premise of this work, right, of the Safety, Respect, Equity Coalition, which I need to say is called the Safety, Respect, Equity Coalition, not the Anti-Harassment Coalition, right? And there's a reason. And the approach of Ta'amod, Stand Up, which is about bringing safety, respect, and equity into Jewish workplaces, is a proactive approach to say, when we create positive culture, when we create culture that is rooted in Jewish values, and when we check mark along the way, benchmark along the way how we're doing that, we intrinsically reduce the probability of abusive behavior in the workplace and harassment. And what we also know from the leading edge engagement surveys and from the rising work of SRE is that we do have a lot of Jewish organizations, and which by the way includes synagogues, that's really important to understand, and day schools, they are workplaces, where harassment, sexual or otherwise, is not an issue, or has not been an issue, plenty where there are, but we also know that there is a real challenge around culture. Abusive behavior, rude and uncivil behavior, and equity issues, right? We know all of this. Is this a characteristic of Jewish organizations? Certainly not. In fact, the research across workplaces writ large, Jewish, not corporate, nonprofit, the trends are the same. But this is where we live, right? This is our work. So the sort of bottom line proposition of all this work is that we need to think of culture as absolutely equal to mission. We need to think of culture almost as the same as our deliverables, right? So in our annual reports and our national board meetings, what are we looking at? What are we thinking about? Are we just looking at what our financials are? Are we just looking at how many programs we delivered this year? Or are we also assessing along the way what culture looks like? And I know that for this board, it's a little bit different in terms of JCC Association's national board, because you're not really involved in what's necessarily going on in the workplace here, but it's a question to be asking along the way of what's happening in our JCCs. So Peter Drucker, who is one of the foundational voices in business management, said culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? You can have all the strategy in the world, but at the end of the day, it's human beings who deliver our work, and if the culture isn't working, our strategy is sort of moot. And not to mention all the research, which we'll talk about later, on negative culture completely impacting bottom line. So there really is a real deliverable reality to that. Culture must be a key component of any organizational strategy, and the two must be compatible. So what's happening with JCC Association and culture?
J-Culture, that's what's happening. We received a $150,000 grant from the Safety, Respect, and Equity Coalition to launch a J-Culture initiative in 5 JCCs around the United States. And I left out Canada because we don't have any of the JCCs from Canada involved in that. Seattle, San Diego, Tucson, Boulder, and Chicago have all stepped up to be our first J-Culture communities. These communities are acting as the center of the town square. They are responsible for holding meetings and making a change in their Jewish community, not just in their JCC. They've come together and they will be meeting in the end of January, right after our MIFGOSH executive directors. They have a team that we're calling a local action team. Every JCC executive director, a person from their board, and a senior staff member will consist of that local action team. And the JCC is sort of that drop in the ripple effect that will permeate their entire community. And their charge over the year of 2020 is to make something happen in their community, whether it has to do with equitable workspaces, whether it has to do with sexual harassment awareness, or other things, what's important to their community. And we will be able to report more 6 months from now when we're all at J Summit, so that you can understand how this is playing out.
So one of the special things I think about the Safety, Respect, Equity Coalition, which I'm going to refer to from now on SRE, so I don't have to keep saying that, is that because there are so many organizations involved, because SRE has granted funds to most, if not all, of the leadership organizations. We have this incredible collective of resources that we're able to call on from one another. So I realize I didn't give you a little background on Top Mode, but Top Mode Stand Up is a partnership with the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York and the Good People Fund, which is a small tzedakah organization that funds good people doing good work, is their motto around the world. And really came together when Me Too broke and said, okay, so what are we going to do in response, as we get involved with the SRE Coalition? And the answer was to fund the go-to address for resources in the Jewish community around issues of harassment prevention and response. And some good work started on the ground, and when I came in, what we started to do was really frame that work in Jewish values. And so when Tom Mode started under a different banner, Fran Sepler, who is, anybody heard her name ever? Fran Sepler, okay, we got one. So she's one of the most renowned workplace culture experts and investigators, and she actually wrote the EEOC's Respectful Workplace Curriculum, and I'm proud to call her my partner. And so we've collaborated on a training for Jewish organizations that couches all of these issues, including legal compliance, in Jewish values. So why? Because respect is the answer, not why, because we need it, but what's the overall frame? That respect is the answer, right? If you go into your Jewish workplace and things are respectful, that means that not only is there a culture of respect and do people feel good about being there, but it also means that there are policies, procedures, clarity in place about how people handle things when they're not going well. So we start with respect in our training, we move on to what derails respect, and we begin to look at first the Jewish values and then how we start at respect and go down the line, which we'll talk about in a minute. So in our training, we actually talk a lot about various Jewish values: justice, justice you shall pursue, and a few other both ancient and current texts and teachers. But the overall frame is kavod, right? So we say this often, kol hakavod, when somebody does something well. We talk about kavod harav, respect for our teachers, our rabbis. But there's a core ideology in an approach in Jewish life, which is kavod habriot. It seems really simple, right? The dignity for all human beings, that we should respect others, means that we have to realize that everybody is the same intrinsic value, and we want to treat others just as we want to be treated, right? Rabbi Hillel actually taught, we think of that as the golden rule, we teach it to our kids, but Rabbi Hillel didn't actually teach treat others the way you want to be treated. Rabbi Hillel taught, do not treat others the way you do not want to be treated, and they're not the same thing. There are lots of things I want in the world that I want to be treated in a certain way that are not guarantees, right? I want my husband to bring me flowers every day. I don't really, but, right? But it's a lot easier to refrain from disrespect than it is necessarily to give everybody what they want. And it's a really simple precept that's really hard to live, right? Every one of us gets agitated, snaps at people. Certainly often our partners and our children, but how many people have ever had a moment at work where you kind of wish you hadn't said the thing you said the way you said it? Nobody will put their hands up, but there are a lot of nods, right? Me too. How many of you have had an experience at work where somebody was truly disrespectful or even abusive to you? There should be more hands than that. Or maybe not, and life is better than I think it is. So if we are constantly looking at, like, what does kavod mean? And the root of the word, every Hebrew word has a root, means heavy, weighty, important. It doesn't mean honor. It actually has the same root as the word for stone. So that's how important it is. Okay, so how do we start figuring out what's going on in our workplaces? So we have a continuum of behavior. And this is Fran Sepler's work as she goes into workplaces and begins to, and our training, and begins to sort of unpack where we start and how we get there. So what do we want all the way to the left? What do we want? What do we want? Great. And what do we want to avoid all the way down at the left? No, all the way down at the left. What do we really want to avoid? Assault. Awesome. So it's very simple, right? Well, in between, along the way, what we have that derail respect is often other sort of less egregious behaviors. And a problem that is 6 days old is a lot easier to solve than a problem that is 6 weeks old, 6 months old, 6 years old. And so if we have culture, which by the way includes bylaws, I was so excited to see that. The two things. One is the Talmudic root that was discussed. Where's Ron? Okay, Ron, that was super cool. The Talmudic, right? Couching, that's how we should be doing all of our work, is benchmarking where we are with Jewish values. And also that you revisit your bylaws so frequently. That is not something a lot of boards do. And the way, Ron, you framed it was because of the changing times, right? You can't heal what you can't see. When we become more aware of certain things going on in our culture, then we as leaders have an opportunity to be in response. So there are certain things that are in bylaws today that just didn't need to be there 20 years ago, 10 years ago. So that's really exciting to see about this organization. So the continuum of behavior. So if what we say as Jewish organizations is, this is what respectful behavior looks like in our workplace. So somebody tell me like a respectful cue. Like what's something that you go into your workplace or a store or your home and you feel like, okay, this is respectful.
Greeting people.
Greeting people. So Pirkei Avot, which is one of our core texts that teaches us how to behave in the world, says greet every person, right? So you walk into work, everybody's had this experience, right? I walk into work, my colleague, who I really like, is already in her office, and I say, good morning, Grace. And she's like, hey, because she's really busy. So that doesn't feel awesome, right? What else? Respectful cues, things that just make you feel respected.
Acknowledgement.
Thank you.
Yeah, same. Okay, acknowledgement, right? I worked really hard on a project. It took a lot of time. I went and did this fabulous presentation, like this one, and I went back to work, and my supervisor comes up to me and says, I have these 15 other things you need to do. Well, is she gonna ask me how the presentation went? You gonna notice that I worked on this for 3 weeks, 3 months, and right? Acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, in my experience as a professional, can mean two things, right? There's acknowledgement as in, you did a good job and I acknowledge your work. And there's acknowledgement in it as in, I asked you a question on an email, please respond, like not 2 weeks later or not at all. And again, these sound like, right, that's how I'd want to be treated, that's how I'd want to behave. And the reality is we just get hooked, right? Life is overwhelming. There's not a single one of us that doesn't have a personal life going on too. And it's challenging. And so what do we have to do? We have to wake up. So if we're awake and we have processes, procedures, culture in place that's saying to our staff, to our community, how's it going? Then when somebody starts to feel disrespected, they know what to do with that behavior, or the organization is there to say, that's not how we do it, right? When that doesn't happen, we end up sometimes along the continuum of abusive behavior. Then it can become unlawful harassing, and the worst, of course, is when it becomes assaultive. But the disrespect, rude, uncivil is actually the core pivotal moment for an organization to pay attention, because as Fran teaches, disrespect, rude, and uncivil behavior is a gateway drug to the next levels, right? If we say, this is where we stop things and people know where to go and what to do, we don't keep moving along the continuum. Yes, sir?
So, one particular way that people are disrespected is when seniors in the staff take credit for a good idea that a junior had. Does that fit in the rude, uncivil area? I'm trying to understand where things get placed and how alarmed to feel about certain types of behavior.
Thank you so much for that question. Did everybody hear the question? Oh, no? Okay. So the first answer is everybody should take our top mode training, because we spend an hour plus exploring exactly that question. And we look at case studies, some of which we're going to look in a little while. This is rude and uncivil, and this is abusive. And the answer to the supervisor taking credit mostly falls into abusive. It's not really so rude and uncivil. It's like taking credit for somebody's work is a pretty terrible way to treat them. And one of your case studies is actually going to look at that a little bit, but in a gender equity context. And so there's actually very specific definitions around what abusive behavior is. I have to say, along the way of doing this specific work for just a year, the stories I hear about known leadership in the Jewish community that is nowhere near harassment, but I'm around a lot of people now who have been in executive positions in the Jewish community, and along the way of getting there, supervisors who were well respected but stand up on chairs and scream at people. That's abusive, right? But we'll talk about in a minute how do Jewish organizations and why tolerate some of this, and some of it is just, well, that's the way he is, right? This is what we said was what a lot of the articles were about with Steinhardt. It's just the way he is. So we need to start asking the question, when is that okay and when is that not okay? So Joy and I decided that we were going to take just a minute, just for those of you who may not have this information, I know there are a lot of lawyers in the room, about what the federal definition of harassment is. This is the federal definition. Every state has, not every state, several states have tweaks on how they define harassment. So you'll see, for instance, in hostile environment, severe and pervasive is a definition by the federal standard. New York redefined that bullet and said, nope, doesn't have to be severe and pervasive, one time is enough. If there's a hostile work environment, if I feel like I've been discriminated against as a protected class, which all of you are who define yourselves as Jews, all of you are who identify as women. By the way, gender harassment does not make a definition around which gender. So anybody can be discriminated against for gender identity. Just a fun fact. Okay, not really so fun though. So there's two kinds of harassment by the federal definition: quid pro quo, which we're all too familiar with those words now. Yes, we can't not laugh. That means a threat, right? If you don't do this, you will lose your job. If you do this, you'll get a promotion. Your salary could be affected. There'll be a disciplinary issue. I'll restructure your assignment. You won't be on that project anymore, or there'll be a withheld opportunity. It's fairly simple. It's fairly straightforward. This for that. Hostile work environment is infinitely less straightforward, right? So a severe pervasive issue, an unwelcome behavior that's coming toward me, something offensive. Clearly, if it's identity-based and explicit, right? If somebody's being discriminated against for race, gender, marital status, there are many others, and it's explicit, like somebody says to me, I'm not giving you this gig because you have blonde hair, right? Repeatedly, hostile work environment, but we all know it happens in a more subtle way than that often. And as determined by a reasonable person, this is a legal term I will not get into, but we do have in harassment law this idea of the reasonable person and what that looks like. I'm sure there are lawyers in the room who know this, and you can ask them about it later. I'm no lawyer. And then just to know that in New York State, there's a whole other list of protected classes other than the federal standard. And guess what? In New York City, there's a whole other list too, because California has 14 more slides in legally compliant training than New York. So, you should know what the laws are in your state, particularly as board members of any organization. And you should just know that only 7 states require harassment prevention training. So we have a ways to go in that. Okay, so that was really just a little piece to make sure that you have a sense, for those of you who may not have known before. As board members, you should know what the definition of harassment is. And now we're going to take a break and look at a text study that you have on your table. It says, "Midot, Jewish values to guide our workplace culture," at the top. So I gave you the kavod frame, and we have a couple of texts that tell us why this is Jewish work. I'm going to give you an opportunity to discuss it yourselves a little bit. So in Judaism, we learn in chavruta, we learn in pairs. If you see you'll see in film or documentaries, you'll see people in the yeshiva, Orthodox men in the yeshiva, are screaming at each other, right? That's learning in chavruta, that we should have the perspective of another person. So I'm going to ask you to pick someone. If you need to be in a trio, that's fine. And take a couple minutes and look at, these are core Jewish values from various texts that have been identified as our midot. There are more than this. These are the ones I've given you. And look at what resonates with you that you would apply to a Jewish workplace value and why? Go. We're not gonna get to unpack for too long, but I'd love to just hear from a couple of people what you talked about. Volunteers who would like to share something you talked about, what some midah that you chose and discussed. Yes, what's your name? Adrian? Yes. Hi, Adrian, thank you. Guarding one's speech, okay, what did you say about that?
I think initially it was my misunderstanding of what Steve shared, he said guarding one's speech, and I was thinking of him maybe being frustrated with having to tone down speech, but that wasn't the reality at all. We're at a very similar place, whereas 20 years ago, things you could say, you can't say now, but you shouldn't say now. Just having the awareness about that and really exploring the opportunity to take note of phrases, of words that we use, and knowing that they can be harmful or damaging to other people, and unknowingly also.
Right, thank you. So, just to summarize quickly for those across the room, the idea that there are things that it was okay to say years ago that now we understand are offensive. It's not a question of are we being asked to be so careful all the time, but more, as I started from the beginning, awareness, deepening and understanding. That might hurt somebody. We now have a better understanding of language, by the way, is critical. There are so many things we can say in one way that hurt and another way that can be heard. And we want to really think about compassion, about Rahmanut in the way that we talk to one another and try to ask ourselves how we want to be treated. And one of the core ideas in how we begin to make change in the workplace is the concept of hineni. What does that mean? I am here, and often in text it's really translated as here I am. I am ready, I am prepared. This is Moses at the burning bush and Abraham when he was called to found the Jewish people that were taught. God called God called, hey person, Abraham, Moshe, and others, and the response was, hineni, I'm here, and it means I'm ready to show up. But when we're stressed, and when we're exhausted, and when we have babies who kept us up all night, and 3 projects that we really, are for 3 people, but we're doing them all, it's really challenging. And so one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what do we have to do as individuals to show up and become hineni? Whether it's beginning to do a practice of taking a breath before we go into a board meeting, right? Or taking a breath when we get an email that we want to shoot back at. How many of us have had that experience of, oh, I wish I didn't press send, right? And it's amazing, I have, whenever I write like an emotionally charged email now, I have my husband check it for me. And inevitably, he's like, take that, he's a rabbi, so. But, take that out, you don't need to say that, right? The other day I wrote, this really is a big deal, and he was like, no, right? What is it gonna be received that if you received, you could hear? One more with the midot. Or Jay, did you wanna add something different? Are you gonna share?
I was
Yes,
gonna share.
please.
So we actually brought up 2 that were similar, and it was interesting to me that one is the first and one is the second to last. A listening ear, and to determine exactly what one hears. And it's funny that you just brought up the anecdote about email, is that more than ever, because of electronic communication and whatnot, there is a disconnect between what the person saying something is intending and what the person receiving is hearing. And I don't have the answer necessarily, except that we should be better about communicating. But there is this dynamic that I feel like more and more is creating, I don't want to go as extreme as a hostile environment, but where...
Depends on the situation.
Yeah, I mean, and I was talking about how I'll receive an email from a client that creates a ton of angst for me, and I think the client is pissed, and I'll spend hours like stressing about it until I finally get them on the phone to learn, no, they just wanted an answer. Right. And we're in a hurry and sent the email a certain way.
Right,
So.
there is no accounting for tone, and one of the best practices for respectful workplaces is when you do have the advantage of having your colleague down the hall is like, get up and go say, excuse me, another respectful practice, right? Don't push if they're super busy, but ask, could you, can I have 5 minutes later? I mean, it's unbelievable. How many of us have had, other relationship issues where when we sat down and talked about it, it was like, okay, we understand each other. So that is a critical practice, and I worked remotely for, I'm still sort of working remotely, but really remotely in another state for 7 years. And it was very, very, very clear that if I had picked up the phone, or my colleague or boss had picked up the phone with certain things, not only would we have avoided yucky, but we also would have handled something in 5 minutes that took 20 emails and wasted everybody's time. Bottom line, it really impacts bottom line, this work. Okay, yes.
Maybe I'm going to be a single voice here. I don't know. It's my Israeli.
Good for you.
Let's say.
But stand up.
No. Sit down. No, my question is, again, it's a different background and culture, but aren't we opening, and I'm not insensitive to abuse, I'm not insensitive to feelings, people's feelings, but there's a fine line between what is really hurtful and abusive and harassment or worse than that, and between people's feelings and, you know, being hurt, and are we not opening up, I mean, the fear of, if you're talking about wasting time, and these things are so subjective, and oh, my feelings are hurt, you know, and the victimhood that can be, or the feeling of victimhood that can be enhanced or encouraged by this, I think it's a fine line. It's dangerous also for the workplace, and I think it can cause people to just be so scared of communicating anything, because, you know, God forbid you're going to hurt someone's feelings. You know, you can't compliment them and say, yeah, you look nice today, because you're going to be slapped with a lawsuit or whatever.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for raising that.
Yeah.
Also, we do work with a lot of Israeli colleagues in our work, and there are cultural differences, and not only Israeli, although my guess is percentage-wise that's higher. Thank you for raising that question. So I just want to say that there are fine lines and there are not fine lines, right? I think for the most part, going back to that legal term of reasonable person, we largely know when we've crossed the line, we hope, to harassment or abuse. Sorry, assault. I would argue, based on my own experience here and as a Jewish professional for a very long time and a congregational spouse, very involved in the larger congregational world, there are very blurry lines around abusive behavior. And the way that and it depends on, you know, what we define as abuse. I think, you know, when somebody comes in and screams and yells at you and calls you names, we know that's abusive. But there are a lot of microaggressions and other ways that people are mistreated in the workplace that, again, and we'll talk in a minute about like why Jewish workplaces might be susceptible to this in some ways, that they're unclear. And especially for young professionals, all abuse is about power, right? Sexual abuse, sexual assault is not even about sex, it's about power. And in our Jewish organizations, we have power hierarchies. And we have to be attentive that when I say to Jay, as Jay's supervisor, you know, I need you to do this, that is very different than when Jay's lateral colleague says, I need you to do this. And I have more power. And how I talk to him matters. How we talk to each other, period, matters, but understanding that power dynamic is really critical. And so the fine lines are absolutely there, and we are living in a culture where this is, you know, if we're going to start at Me Too, at the beginning of the slide deck, this is 2 years old, right? Maybe we're a little bit longer now. We're figuring it out. We're figuring it out, right? We don't know all the answers yet. What we do know is we can become hineni and wake up to it. And that in our organizations, our job is to have these conversations and to begin to set some norms, okay? We begin to set a brit, a covenant. In this organization, this is acceptable and this is not. So it might be this. What's your name again? Donna. Thank you for asking that question. It might be that I walk up to you, Donna, and I say, you know, I really love your sweater, but I realize that right now, like, is it okay with you if I compliment you in general? And you'll go, please compliment me, I love it, right? Or you might say, actually, like, for women particularly, who often feel like, you know, I don't want to be really valued about what I look like, period, so no, I don't want to hear it, it's okay. But we ask questions, we become hineni, we become present to what's going on in our culture. Yes, I also would say bring it on, okay? Like, and that's a whole other conversation about how women perceive themselves. And I mean, you want to have a gender equity workshop around women and perception of their appearance, that's a whole other one. I can do that one too though, just so you know. Okay, that's my other background. Okay, so we have about 57 topics we could bring up and talk about all day, but we're gonna move on to Joy telling us why respectful behavior is just the baseline, right? It's very subjective. So how do we do it? How do we create that culture?
So as we talked about before, it really talks about understanding and communication and education. And as we heard, there's a variety of ways that different states are requiring that we educate and communicate these pieces of information with staffs. New York State being one of the stronger, more progressive states that's requiring. Not all states are requiring any kind of sexual harassment awareness training. And we also talk about a climate of communication, feedback, understanding how leadership sees things, including leadership in the conversations. We have to be transparent in the way that we talk about this as well. And so that that falls right into the next piece in equity and pay scale and advancement opportunities. There are a number of things that are bubbling up now about transparency and equity in pay, and how that has held back so many people from understanding what the pay scales are, whether they're in the synagogues or the day schools or the JCCs, the federations, specifically in the Jewish community, where more and more people are starting to understand what that means to be transparent in the equity and pay scales. And then we have to also talk about what's the diversity and equity in hiring, and what's that pipeline to leadership, and how have people not been able to understand what the next steps are in getting to wherever they want to be in the leadership pipeline. And it's our responsibility to make sure that these things are out there in the community, that people understand how they can take those next steps into the leadership pipeline. And we also have to understand that these are not just Jewish values that are guiding us. They're humanistic values. It doesn't matter what the religion of the people are that are working in the Jewish community. Everybody pretty much has the same values. And it's really important that we keep that in mind as we move this issue forward and we learn more and more about it. Here at JCC Association, in 2019, we had total compliance with the New York State rules and the New York City rules in training all of our staff in the sexual harassment awareness. And we also recently published the new employee handbook. Thank you to Andy, working with our senior leaders to get that published. These are the ways that Jewish organizations can really say, Hineni, here we are, we're ready to take on these conversations, we're ready to do the sexual harassment awareness trainings. We also here at JCC Association have a way of anonymously reporting. It's called the Lighthouse Services. There's an 800 number, there's an email address, there's all different ways that if there is something here at JCC Association, the staff here have a way that they are able to do reporting as well. And so you can see how this is just the beginning, as we said, really 2 years into this, and how we're going to be working with the individual JCCs to help them move along on the continuum as well.
Thanks. So just to make one more point about this, when we talk about how we figure out the fine lines, right? Again, it's the conversation. So the policy and procedure also means people know what it is. We talk about it, we revisit it, we have this climate of feedback and transparency, the conversations are happening. And when we do this, we end up with employee engagement, right? It is the key factor for positive workplaces. And this is not, you know, leading edge, not that leading edge isn't phenomenal, their research is phenomenal, but this is not Jewish community research. This is, you know, the Gallup, by the way, if you're interested in best practice, workplace practice, you know, the Gallup poll, they do an enormous amount of workplace culture research. And the key, we know, I mean, I've read a couple of their reports, it's unbelievable how at the end of the day, feeling valued, secure, supported, and respected, which is the key factor for positive workplaces, is the #1 factor in employee engagement, above all else, above benefits, above salary, right? If you go to work every day and you make a great salary and you get great benefits, but you're treated terribly, why would you feel engaged in the organization that you're working in? So when we do this work, including for us specifically, paying attention to Jewish values and guiding principles across all facets of the organization. The rabbi does not deserve more respect than the maintenance staff. And how do we make sure across the board that everybody feels safe and respected? And there may be things, I just want to say, in our organizational culture that people don't like. That's fine. Liking everything about your workplace culture is not the same thing as respect, right? I may not love like they don't want me to wear jeans to work, right? I think that's really stupid. What difference is it? Okay, fine, but it's part of my workplace. It's not disrespectful, right? So we don't have to like it. We have to come from a place of respect. And we know that when we do this, there are direct bottom line results for the organization, right? People feel valued, they can speak up, provide feedback, etc. And it doesn't matter what your role is in the organization, it's a safe place to do that. Stress decreases, huge amount of research on the physical ramifications of workplace stress, which then eventually impacts performance, engagement, collaboration, and retention. Costs an organization more money to rehire, right, to replace staff than it does to respond to making sure that that person is getting what they need in employee engagement. Then people want to work there, has a good reputation. All of these things we're trying to avoid happen less or not at all, and most importantly, the organization is self-correcting. Nobody's going to do it perfectly. There are going to be mishaps, there's going to be abuse, things are going to happen. But the organization knows how to self-correct, and that's a core value. And for us specifically, people feel good about the Jewish community and Jewish communal life. One of the things that is specifically challenging for Jewish communal workplaces is that you have a bad experience and you don't necessarily just leave Jewish communal life, but you maybe say, I'm done with the Jewish community. That's a whole other risk value for us, right? Talmud is establishing an info line over the next couple of months where people can call who have had bad experiences. And in some of the history of doing this work before, we're working with a domestic abuse line in DC that's been taking these calls in the Jewish community forever. And I said to them, I need to make sure, I know you have the legal resources and the therapeutic resources and other things people might need, but what about when the person calls and says, I'm done being Jewish because I had this experience. I need to know that you guys can deal with that. Do you want some training? And she said, we deal with those calls twice a week. So part of employee engagement, part of our most respectful workplace culture is gender equity. These are just a couple statistics, thank you, from Gallup, because people like statistics, and it's legit, I'm not making it up. So organizations, companies that have female mentoring programs, they have up to 50% better retention and advancement in women in a company. Companies where female employees can contribute and succeed experienced 147% higher earning rates. So it's real. And part of gender equity is around parental leave policies. It is not just for women. It is parental leave. It is no longer paternity or maternity. It is parental, because all parents deserve that time to engage in their early parenting, and because some parents are adoptive parents, and some parents, are same-sex couples where only one person had the baby, et cetera, et cetera. But, wait, sorry, right? Wait, my husband didn't have the baby either, sorry, but. Okay, same-sex couple where no one had the baby, same as adoptive. I've gone down a terrible rabbit hole. Okay. Good parental leave policies show us a 50% reduction in the rate at which new mothers leave the company. When parents don't have enough space to breathe in the early days of parenting, sometimes they don't go back to work. Why is this particularly challenging for Jewish communal workplaces? Did I skip it? No, it's next, right? Yeah. We're small, we have no human resources often. That's a key factor. Lots of our organizations do not have an HR professional, so you have to know where to go and what to do. Under-resourced, time, money, people. The board is not connected to the staff culture. This is a critical question. What can lay leaders do to make sure that they're checking in on what's happening with culture? There's that family mentality, like, we don't want to talk about what, we need to be careful, we need to be attentive to our Jewish community's reputation, we don't want to talk about this being a problem here. And that generational continuum sometimes, well, that's just how she is, that's just how he is. and that's the way it is. Well, maybe it's just not okay that that's the way it is. So we're gonna give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about what some of these experiences look like. You have case studies on your table. There are 3 case studies. I'm gonna assign them to you. So there's one on gender equity, one on abusive behavior, yeah, you're gonna do it as a group, and one on harassment. So I wanna invite you to choose. We'll just choose at your table which one you wanna talk about. Go.
I want to gender inequity. That's what so much fun All staff is present. These are something about the Laurie does. He's getting credit, even though he's been well, now maybe there's reasons to go beyond the presentation and the context now. You know, she's so level, forming and all that. So the mentoring, something's missing in my reading. Would be good. Is she not speaking out? What's being said? It's really
adults too, awesome, thank you. So I'm collectively apologizing for myself and Joy that we're pushing time a little bit and we want to get you to lunch. So we're not gonna, we would have given you another solid 5 minutes on this, but take them with you, think about them, because the core questions at the bottom, what's happening here? Who's responsible? What can be done? These are questions that are how we become humane and we start to ask ourselves, what do we do? How do we look at these things? So we're going to talk for a minute about what lay leaders can do, and then we're going to wrap up.
Okay, so when we talk about what lay leaders, I'm better behind the question. What lay leaders are going to be doing, we talk about what the demographic makeup of our staff is and understanding how you have an influence on that, and take a look at what it looks like on the boards where you sit. What reporting mechanisms are in place? I talked about what we have here at JCC Association. It's okay to ask those questions of the boards where you sit so that you can understand and be a more informed lay leader for that organization or agency that you're working with. And what are the feedbacks and the concerns and how does it feel? Are the staff comfortable in making complaints and understanding that you as a lay leader should have known or do know? And there's all kinds of law that has to do with what are the responsibilities of a lay leader if you should have known that there was something happening, specifically around sexual harassment and sexual abuse. And it varies from state to state, so please be involved in understanding what that is in your own states. What's the organization doing to provide leadership and guidance to the staff about these values? And that should be something that's not just talked about because the state mandates it, but something that is done on a regular basis, on a new hire, as you onboard your staff. Understand what's happening and help them understand what the culture of the organization is, and so that you can be involved in that as well. And then understanding how we can really ensure what that respectful workplace is. All of these things come down to the communication about what's important and how it's unraveling and how it's building people up. You want to talk about this?
Oh, I was getting to that.
Okay. And JCC Association is helping JCCs have those conversations and build out these understandings across the United States and Canada.
So what are some tools that we can use? We talked about an employee handbook, which is useless if we don't know what's in it, and unpack it with our staff. Do your homework. Know what's going on in the movement. Know what's going on in workplace culture. Know what's happening around these issues in the Jewish community. If you don't subscribe to E-Jewish Philanthropy, that's a resource that is consistently publishing culture topics every day. Some organizations do an employee survey. They anonymously allow professionals to check in a couple of times a year and ask some very basic questions that tell them how respectful culture is doing in the organization. And support your leadership, right? Most boards are in direct communication only with the CEO or exec of an organization. What are you doing to help that person and to help the leadership of your lead leadership? Put culture at the top of the list in terms of priorities for an organization. And lastly, lo lecha hamlecha likmor, right? It's not our duty to complete the work. One of your esteemed colleagues just approached me to remind me that the Me Too movement is just another leg of a very, very, very long struggle and unbelievable amount of progress for women in gender equity. And that when young women like me, well, am I young anymore? I think so. Stand up and talk about these issues, that I am standing up on the backs of the women who allowed me to have a profession, who allowed me to vote, right? Who allowed us to come to a place where women can be in the equitable places we are today, and that doesn't mean we don't have a lot more work to do. It's slow systemic change. Systemic change is not fast. But all of these practices and questions, conversations, we become hineni, we become present, and we have the chance to make the change. You can't heal what you can't see. But it's not our duty to complete the work, it is our duty to keep the work going and keep growing it beyond to the next step as we learn more. We have no time for questions, but I just want to say...
You say it's the presentation?
We can send you certain slides if you ask for them, yeah.
Not certain, not the entire.
Joy and I can talk about that. There's a couple things we might have to pull out, like Fran's continuum of behavior is her intellectual property. So I don't know, but we can talk about putting together what we can send. Definitely the questions and the tools and all of that, we'll put together a version and send it around. Just very, very much lastly, I want to make sure you understand who and what Talmud is doing in the community so you can take advantage of our resources. We have a robust resource bank online that is ever growing. So if you have a resource around respectful workplace culture, harassment, gender equity that you know could be an individual who wants to give pro bono legal services. It could be an organization, therapeutic support, workplace culture consultants. They should be in our resource bank. Please help us build it. We offer this training around, the info line is coming, and we offer this training around safe, respectful workplaces. While it's legally compliant, it's an organization's choice, and it's making a big statement to say, we're going to bring in a Talmud training for 4 hours for employees and 4 hours for supervisors and talk about these bigger issues. So if you want to know more about that, I'm here, and all your JCC should do it, but that's my conversation with Joy. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Nicole. It was wonderful.